Do it.
This is Dr. Winston Vickers, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yes, you are. I'm in the tent trying to get my equipment to work. It's not cooperating, but we're going to march on forward. And I got my good buddy Dave Raetz on the show. He's been on before. He runs the Irvine, what is it? The Irvine Natural Conservatory. I don't know. You're going to tell me what the heck it is. He works in a space that's really fascinating in that he helps manage, conserve, preserve wild spaces here in Orange County. And his episode is fascinating because he must partner with 25 different organizations, agencies, academic people. And so I said, hey, Dave, when we were camping, hey, Dave, why don't we get some of these brilliant people that talk about these different aspects of nature and habitat and human interaction and all these things. And he's like, well, let's get Winston on because he knows all about big cats. And I said, done, let's do it. So Dave, tell us a little bit more about Winston and the work that you do so we can get started.
Well, kind of the relationship between what we do and Winston is really critical. The Irvine Ranch Conservancy is contracted by public landowners to manage large scale open space areas in Orange County, which most people don't even think is there, but it is. And part of our role is to kind of monitor the health of these ecosystems. And one really good way to monitor the health is some of the top predators and those indicator species that let us know, are we doing okay, or are we in trouble? Like, what's going on? And mountain lions are definitely one of, they are the key species to kind of keep tabs on in the areas that we manage. They also go way beyond the areas that we manage and go into other areas and other landowners areas. And so it's been really critical, the work that Winston has done for us in making management decisions and working with multiple agencies and trying to help maintain the lion populations because they're so critical to us. And Winston's got exceptional knowledge of mountain lions in the state of California. I think what we're experiencing in Orange County is happening in other areas. Like, I know Santa Monica Mountains is also struggling with some of these same types of concepts that Winston is really working hard to help solve. And he's just done an extensive amount of work with other agencies in our area as well as us, and been a tremendous help to us and tremendous work. So go ahead, Winston.
I started to say thanks.
Maybe you could start with kind of talking about mountain lions in the state of California in general, and then kind of narrow it down into what's happening in Orange County, because I think Orange County is a little bit different than a lot of other areas in the state. So, and there's some real movement to kind of change things and how they're perceived and how they're regulated and all that kind of stuff. And it's something that is really interesting and probably definitely needs to happen in various areas of the state. So
yeah, you're right, Dave. The statewide mountain lions exist across a lot of different types of habitat. Here in Orange County, we have the local mountains, and that's kind of where we think of as the mountain lions being, and that is where they are, and that's the coastal mountain habitat, the shrub and coastal sage scrub, and then some of the forest areas. Statewide, though, they can exist and across the entire west of the U.S. They exist in all kinds of habitat, everything from desert to the high Sierras, and so they are an incredibly adaptive species. That's one of their things we can admire about them, and the reason they're still around across the West, because during the bounty period, there were many species like the wolves and the grizzlies and so forth that just totally disappeared from the West. But mountain lions have managed to persist, even though their numbers were driven pretty low in California back in the bounty era, which lasted up through the 60s. But now they've rebounded from being aggressively hunted to now being what we've considered to be probably in a fairly stable state. But in certain areas like Orange County, the Santa Ana Mountain Range, the Santa Monica's mountain ranges in Southern California, and even out in what we classify as the Eastern Peninsular Range, the Palomars and and the Cuyamacas and out there in San Diego County, their mortality rates are high. They are compared to a lot of populations, even hunted populations in the West. They have high mortality rates. And it's primarily because they get hit by cars and because they get killed when they kill somebody's goat or sheep animal, usually small groups. They're not a big problem for commercial sheep and goat raisers typically, or cattle, because those folks usually have guard dogs and have more protective mechanisms in place. But people with just a few goats or sheep in the backyard, or small numbers of livestock, oftentimes aren't necessarily quite aware enough that their animals can be at risk if they are out there in the sort of rural areas, not in the woods, but close to the woods. So we do lose quite a substantial number of mountain lions when they kill one of those animals. That is changing, though, from a policy perspective somewhat. And feel free to break in and ask me a question if you feel like it.
Sure.
But as you mentioned, I think there is some change going on where it's more difficult to get a permit to kill a mountain lion. If someone has lost a sheep or a goat that wasn't well protected, like in a barn or something like that, then Cal Fish and Wildlife will require them to change their husbandry and improve their protection before they can get a permit to actually kill a mountain lion. And so that has cut down on some of the permit issuing, and hopefully is cutting down some on mortality rates from that cause. A lot of it is just educating people, and it's easy to kind of take the easy way out sometimes, and not, even if you've got a barn, not necessarily bring them in every night, but that does increase the risk to the domestic animal and to the mountain lion both.
Yeah, I know we lost one to this exact situation out in Silverado a couple of months ago, and they had actually they had caught it, I think, in a goat pen on someone's property. Yeah. They relocated it. It came right back, and somehow or another it ended up deceased. So I don't know the details on the end part of it, but that I do know. I believe it was a big male, from what I heard. So, which is unfortunate when when you're talking about some of the islandized issues that are going on in the Santa Ana Mountains. So can I ask you can you give us kind of the comparison? You talked about these areas in Santa Monica and Orange County and San Diego. Are other areas of the state experiencing these same type of issues, as we're having in the southern part of the state?
The isolation by roads is a big issue, and at some point, perhaps Pete can pull up one of the maps that shows the distribution of mountain lions genetically across the state. What we have found was statewide. So here's a map that he pulled up that has the habitat, and you can see the suitable habitat is fairly widely dispersed. A lot in the Sierras, along the coastal ranges, then down to south. Not a lot of suitable habitat, though, out in the desert. So desert areas don't really support very many mountain lions, but other parts of California can. And then what has happened, though, with highways and development is that these populations have been divided into multiple different populations. And the ones in the Santa Monicas, actually the San Bernardinos and San Gabriels out to the east of LA, the Eastern Peninsulars, and then Santa Ana's here in Southern California, all of those populations are separate from each other. And then they in turn are separated from the coastal populations. And so up in Santa Cruz, Santa Monica, Santa Ana's, all these populations are suffering from genetic restriction. Some of them have higher population mortality levels than others, but they all are at risk from inbreeding, and especially the most at risk are the Santa Anas and the Santa Monicas. Those are relatively small populations. They're very inbred, almost as inbred as the Florida panther, which is the population of mountain lions that's in Florida in the Everglades, and they are listed as federally endangered.
I want to ask about
Yeah.
when I grew up right on the edge of town in the Bay Area, and it was just golden hills rolling for a dozen miles, if not more, right? And it was undeveloped. Yeah. And even back then, this is the 70s, early 80s, there was at least one big cat that you would see out there from time to time roaming around. And at some point it disappears, but over the years we've added turkey, a lot of turkey, deer, like good sized deer out there. And so there must be a cat out there again. The area is a lot more developed, but there's still quite a bit of open space. How much space does a mountain lion need? And then if you're in a community that hasn't had a big cat around for a long time and all of a sudden you see it, what's the appropriate response to the, like, we don't mind when there's a deer walking across the street. You're like, oh, that's great. Nature's making a comeback. But when that thing's a kitty cat that weighs 100 pounds, we freak out. So how much space do they need? And then what's the appropriate frame of mind we need to handle this with?
From my perspective, the appropriate frame of mind is be aware that the risk from that mountain lion, even the ones that wander into town now and then, is incredibly low. And in fact, as far as I know, there's never been an attack, within a city or town type environment. And even out in the woods, the attacks are incredibly rare. But the ones that wander into towns and in these sort of mixed environments like you're describing, but where the deer are, they do come into those areas close to people periodically to hunt, mostly at night, and mostly the younger animals, sometimes females with kittens, will be more likely to be around housing. Young males that are migrating, almost all the animals that get caught in a backyard or chased up a tree by a pet dog, those are almost always young males that are searching for territory. So they're dispersing, they're trying to find a way, and they have no idea where they are. It'd be like putting one of us down in a totally strange environment and saying, okay, find a home. They have to wander around and look the landscape over. And it's really challenging for them. And they have the highest mortality rates of all, is those young males, because by their nature of having to migrate to get out of their father's territory and, go somewhere else, they may travel 100 miles or more. And that means they have to cross a lot of roads. They have to cross through other territories of other males. It puts them in a lot of danger, from a variety of sources. Males are also a bit more likely to depredate or kill livestock, the backyard animals, because again, they're coming around the edges. They're just working their way through the landscape, and they're at higher risk. And once a male is established, for instance, he'll occupy a territory in our area in Southern California of around 150 square miles. So it's a big terrain. They have to move a lot. So they encounter a lot of roads. They encounter people periodically. And that, increases the risk, especially the roads in our area. The females, their territory is about half that size. So they're covering territory, all the time to hunt and find food. And one of the ironies when they are traveling around closer to people and hunting closer to people, if we think of Orange County, some parts of LA, between the swimming pools and the orchards and the other attractants to other wildlife like deer, we're attracting a lot of wildlife in close to people, and naturally the predators, follow that. We know what an issue sometimes coyotes are in some parts of California or Southern California, and they're the number 2 food source for mountain lions after deer. So they like to eat the coyotes, and we attract the coyotes, and we attract the deer, and so it's all an interesting mix out there.
Winston, can I ask? I know, we had talked many years ago when you were actually doing tracking. There were situations where there was, like activities going right by where we knew the lions were, and that makes people very, very nervous. Can you talk about? I think there's this false sense of fear that if you see a lion, it's going to attack you and eat you and that kind of stuff. And as you mentioned that attacks are really, really rare. Unfortunately, Orange County has a couple of them.
Right.
But I can you kind of talk a little bit about trying to alleviate some of that fear that and I know like we had activities that were going by where the lion was actually you knew where the lion was. And the reaction of the lion when people came by was it just sat there. it watched everybody go. And I know from being in land management for over 20 years, they're always out there. We probably walk by them a lot. And they just do their thing. So if you could speak on that a little bit, I think it would help the public with some of their fears.
Well, that's very true. The rarity of attacks is a function, we think, and maybe we don't know for sure what's in every mountain lion's brain, but they are individuals. We do know general tendencies that they have is to stay away from people. We know that when they, from some of the studies, that when they are feeding, like say they've killed a deer not too far from a house, they won't stay there as long feeding on that deer as if they had killed it further away. So we humans make them uneasy. So generally they try to stay tucked away from where we are, but they may not be that far, as you mentioned. Sometimes they'll be fairly close to a trail. They may even, especially the young males, again, they're not too brilliant. They're like kind of teenage boys, I think. They just kind of hang out. They tend to be the animals that people see that don't necessarily run away immediately, tend to be these young, kind of curious animals. But they are rarely the animal that attacks anyone. So it's, they're the ones that get seen, but they're typically the ones where there's the lowest risk. As you mentioned, though, in Orange County, we've had a number of attacks over the decades, and even one early last year in Orange County. And what we know from the rather sparse data, there was an analysis looking at 100 years of attacks across all of North America. And they found that it was predominantly involving small children or people of small stature, more on the eye level with the lion, if you think about it that way, a little more the size of their prey, not terribly big or as threatening to them perhaps. And plus children tend to be moving more quickly, erratically, kind of, like a pet cat is going to have its eye attracted to rapid and erratic movement. And so the majority of attacks were people that were either running or biking or, those of small stature. So movement, small stature, those were risk factors. So I always really emphasize if people are out there with their kids, on the trails, keep the kids really close to them, because when attacks have occurred on kids, if their parents were right there, so they could jump on the situation and beat on the mountain lion or whatever was necessary. And there was an account just like that a few weeks ago up in the Santa Monica's near Calabasas, where the woman, actually this was in a backyard, so I'll correct my previous statement about attacks occurring in town. But that is the only one I know of that has occurred that way. They're usually out on trails. But having small children, especially, I don't know an age range, but small, you want to be with them, not let them be 50 yards down the trail way ahead of you around the bend. That way, if anything did happen in that rare event, then a parent or an adult, can intervene.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's funny because I have a daughter and she's very petite and always has been. And we would go hiking all the time. And I'm like, you're right here. You're right here. You are not running ahead. You're staying right here.
Yeah, that's wise. It's like the rare events, but significant if it does happen. So
I would rather not be in that event.
Yeah, exactly.
I got a question on species types. So we hear catamount, mountain lion, puma, jaguar, all kinds of different nomenclature, and they all sort of look the same. And I that's just a layman's term, but is there a difference? Is it all mountain lions? I mean, and a Florida panther is not really from Florida anymore. I mean,
yeah.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, good question. So all the mountain lions in North America, including the Florida panther, are one species, but they do have a ton of different names. And across in South America, there are several different distinct species based on their genetics. But in North America, it's all the same species. But the names, puma, mountain lion, cougar, panther. The Florida panther is a subspecies of the larger species by technical definition, but and they're called a panther. Catamount, you mentioned. I think across all of the Americas, they have between 20 and 30 different names. So there's just huge confusion sometimes in the nomenclature. You mentioned jaguar. That is a different species, but among those others I mentioned, they're all mountain lions. And it's regional. In Colorado, they call them mostly cougars. In Southern California, we call them mountain lions. Pumas are much more the common term in New Mexico. So it's kind of regional naming as far as dominant names too.
Nice. So can you speak a little more about the genetic bottlenecking that you've mentioned, and what does that mean? Like what for the long-term survival of the species in these areas where they've been islandized by habitat types and roads and urban development. Why is genetic bottlenecking such a problem?
When you talk about islandization and what that means, because I don't know if they're Channel Island cats, or help me understand.
Okay.
Yeah, he's probably. I know he's referring to this. Basically, we've created especially the coastal mountain ranges have become islands, with freeways dividing them and development. And so the Santa Anas are essentially an island of habitat divided from the Eastern Peninsula Range, the Palomars by I-15 and Temecula development, and really development all up and down I-15. The same goes for the separating those mountains and Mount San Jacinto, the San Jacintos from the San Bernardinos and the San Gabriels. I-10 is a barrier through there, and the desert is a barrier, because if you go out I-10, there are stretches of I-10 going out that don't have any development alongside the freeway, but there's desert out there, and for mountain lions at least, that can be a barrier, oddly enough, because they just don't like crossing open ground. They like to stay in the cover and stuff, so they don't like to venture out into open desert very much. So barriers are not just man-made. The Sierra crest is something of a barrier, apparently. The Eastern Sierra mountain lions are genetically different than the Western Sierra lions. So we have natural barriers, but also a lot of man-made barriers in California. And what happens then is if they can't connect, then they start getting more and more inbred, because they're just what you expect. They're just their girlfriend happens to be their cousin, who's their mother's second whatever, and and unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen. We've constructed pedigrees with all our genetic samples from the Santa Anas and the Eastern Peninsula Range, and we have found that we only detected 3 animals that had come across I-15 from the east to the west in 15 years of our study. So very, very few animals coming in, and of those 3, only 1 reproduced. So that one is the only one we could find that had brought in new genetic material. And he produced 11 offspring that we found, and he did give a boost. Just that one individual was enough to give a boost to the genetics in the Santa Anas. But John Benson, one of our collaborators, did what's called a population viability analysis that looked at the Santa Anas and the Santa Monicas, and both populations are at risk of extinction because of genetics, along with their high mortality rates when you combine the two, because inbred animals tend to not have good reproductive rates. And the males, this is what happened in Florida. The males quit reproducing very effectively. They got defective sperm and other things that related to inbreeding. And then the kittens didn't have good survival. They weren't as robust. So you had low kitten survival, low reproduction, and the Florida panthers almost went extinct. And John has calculated that in the Santa Anas, we could lose that population in as little as 15 years if those reproductive problems emerge. And we're just starting to see a little bit of evidence of that. So we're pretty worried that these populations could, those 2 especially, could get into real trouble and even go extinct without help in a pretty short time frame.
So when you say without help, what are the options for trying to resolve this issue? I mean, I know what they are. I could throw some out there. I know there's work going on trying to create corridors that allow safe passage through these barriers. There's other programs like you tranquilize a lion and you relocate it to a new area. I mean,
right.
All of these things are stuff going on. But I think if you could talk a little bit about some those items that I've said, but also the regulatory world and how is this affecting the regulatory world in the state of California when it comes to mountain lions and these localized populations that are in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you say, there's 2 main ways. One is to improve their ability to move naturally. And since we know that the main areas where they approach the highway and they get killed on the highway, speaking of I-15, for instance, the Temecula Creek runs under I-15 and normally would be a pretty good passageway, but there's a lot of human trespass in there, a lot of camping, just a lot of human presence, and that's a barrier because to the mountain lions behaviorally. So we know that's an issue that we can solve with enough effort, perhaps, but stopping trespassing is a challenge, as you know from Irvine Ranch Conservancy. And so then the other thing is to make new passageways. And so there's engineering that's been done and engineering ongoing now with Caltrans to create a new crossing structure of some type, an undercrossing or an overcrossing. And that's the ideal thing, is to create enough options for animals that approach the highway that they don't go out on the highway and get killed, but instead they find that crossing and go across that way. And that's ultimately the long-term solution. In the short term, though, if we detect that our numbers of lions are on the decline, or we detect a lot of this inbreeding depression sign, then there's certainly conversations going on with Cal Fish and Wildlife about moving animals. And then you start to factor in some of the complications of that. Where do you bring them from? Is it better to bring them from way up in the Sierras because you get a lot of different genes? Or is it better to bring them from a more adapted population east of the 15 that's more adapted to local conditions? Because that can affect survival. And do you bring a young male or do you bring a young female? Which is going to survive better? Probably the young female. But a young male or even an adult male that can avoid getting killed, by the existing males, has a little more bang for the buck in terms of ability to spread genes around, to multiple females. So this is a balance that's being talked about and modeled, and there's no exactly right answer. And you want to consider disease. You don't want to accidentally introduce some virus that maybe another population is adapted to, but our population isn't. So it's kind of complicated.
How do you, and maybe this is one of those things where we kind of humanize animals. How much stress is it on a cat, male, female, old, young, to be moved? I mean, are they being ripped away from their family? How does this stuff matter? I mean, the psychological well-being of the cat. Like, if you just get this mopey, sad cat because it wants to go back to Modoc, I mean, is that a thing? Or I don't know. You tell me.
Well, they will try to return. That's pretty well established. A territorial animal is probably going to try to go back home. And then, of course, they could get killed crossing the highways headed back. So that's a factor that we think about. And that's been shown multiple times in multiple studies. So clearly, those animals are more likely to head back. When you bring a new animal in or you take an animal out, you do upset social orders. Mountain lions have social structure because of these large male territories that have multiple females within them. And it's been shown that when you remove the big adult male, for instance, from a population, whether they're killed for whatever reason, or if we removed one, it is going to upset the apple cart in that population for a while. And you'll have young males come in and compete, for that male territory. And this has also been shown. A recent paper by Justin Dellinger of CDFW showed an association between males being removed from a population because they killed a livestock animal, for instance, and that when you have more of that going on, you tend to have even more killing of livestock the following year. And some work up in Washington State showed the same thing, that when you remove adult dominant males, you get an influx of young juvenile males. And so basically you have more males on the landscape than you had before if you're looking at a given area. And there you increase your risk, to the livestock. So the upsetting of the social order is a concern, and bringing in a new animal is gonna if it's a male, they're gonna try to displace an existing male, and there's going to be conflict. So it's a sticky wicket, as they say.
I want to ask a follow up. Okay. I'll let Dave ask. So when we try to manage these things, I remember as a kid when Mount St. Helens blew up, like, we're going to manage just part of the forest and then see how the forest does on its own. And the forest on its own kicked our ass. It just was so much better at biodiversity and everything else. Is this one of your guys' things too, where like you can't match the biodiversity and the natural, because you're trying to manage something that doesn't want to be managed? Is that the same thing for big cats, or is it easier?
It is the same. Yeah. I throw the, and all the agencies throw around the term managing probably a little loosely when it comes to mountain lions. Yeah, you're right. It's mostly they're going to do what they're going to do, and you can move them around or whatever, but you're really sort of shifting the chess pieces, but they're going to do their thing. And these migrating males are a great example of that. You just cannot predict where they're going to end up. The only male that we've had that had a GPS collar on and migrated across I-15, we've only had one, and he went from west to east, and he crossed I-15 successfully, headed out to the east, almost to the desert, almost to the Salton Sea. Then he headed south, almost to the border. Then he headed back west. And so he made this big circuit, and all of that in about 2.5, maybe 3 weeks time. So he was just booking it. And we see these young males do that. They'll circulate with their mother if they've got a collar on. We see their pattern of circulation, and they're going in this sort of defined area where their mother lives. And then one day they just take off. It's like something snaps and away they go. And they tend to go kind of in straight directions once they start until they run into a barrier and then they have to divert. Unfortunately, that male ran into a sheep farm and killed somebody's sheep. And of course, he's in strange terrain. He doesn't even know where the deer are necessarily. And, he kills somebody's sheep and they killed him. So he was our one example of an animal that was able to successfully cross I-15. And then he was killed 3 weeks later before he could, do anything genetically for the population. So it's they really have a hard life, and if they get established, they still have a hard life because they have to defend territories. The females have to feed young. So they have their challenges for sure.
Is there any like statistics on the success rate of like an introduction for mountain lions, or like when you look at it and you're weighing your options, like how good is an introduction of an animal,
right?
What are your odds of success?
Well, we have no real examples except the Florida panther, because they did introduce mountain lions from Texas. I think they're called cougars more often, and they brought in
changed states, so they changed names.
They changed names after they crossed the state line, and they brought, I think my numbers are correct, 8 females from Texas. I think relatively young or mature enough to reproduce at least, and the majority of those survived. I believe 5 or 6 of the 8 reproduced, and the numbers may not be exact, but by and large, they had success with those animals reproducing. They introduced a substantial number of new genes, and the Florida population gained much greater survivability of the kittens, and the population expanded pretty dramatically, so that they were down to around 15 animals in the whole state at that point that those animals were introduced, and now they're over 100. I forget what the current number is, maybe even 150. Their limitation now is how much space they have, much more than that. But they have calculated that the what's called genetic drift is occurring, and so they're drifting backwards, in terms of the genetic variety. And they will have to ultimately bring in more animals from Texas or somewhere to boost the genetics again at some point.
Interesting. Very interesting. Definitely. So earlier we were talking about what's being done to allow those genetics to come in. And I had mentioned a little bit about regulatory stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what's changing in the regulatory world locally? Because I know, as you mentioned before, there's some push to, the Santa Ana species, or the Santa Ana mountain lions are being pushed for either threatened species status or possibly endangered, and that is abnormal for the Department of Fish and Game or Fish and Wildlife. Mm-hmm. So like what's changing there? How is this happening?
Well, there was a petition filed, which groups can file, and in this case, it was filed by 3 groups. The lead was the Center for Biological Diversity, okay. And they filed a petition based on all of our research findings collectively across the state, and especially this population viability analysis and the overall genetic analysis across the state that showed that multiple populations were getting pretty substantially inbred, and that the risk to these 2 populations, specifically Santa Monica's and Santa Ana's, were fairly high of extinction. So they filed the petition, and the way that process works is the petition is then either accepted for analysis or not by the Fish and Game Commission. And then once they've accepted it, which they have, then it went to the Department of Fish and Wildlife to evaluate the petition. And so that petition is currently still in that evaluation process. So it's basically the commission accepts it, the Department of Fish and Wildlife evaluates the science that is cited, in the petition to support it, and whether that science really does support listing of the animals as either threatened or endangered. And that petition requested that 6 populations be listed: from Santa Cruz, the Central Coast, the Southern Coast, the Santa Monica's basically across to the Santa Barbara, San Gabriel's and San Bernardino's, the San Jacinto's, and then the Santa Ana's if we go north to south. And that those 6, the idea is that they should be connected into one big population to have long-term viability genetically. And there's been another paper that calculated that in order to have a large enough area of protected habitat to support a large enough population, continually connected or easily connected, you would have to connect the San Bernardinos and San Gabriel's and the San Jacinto's and the Peninsulars and the Santa Ana's into one population. And even then, there's not enough protected habitat to support it long-term genetic health-wise. So we have a lot of work to do to bridge all these freeways and get animals across the freeways. And the most famous freeway project is up on the 101, bridging for the Santa Monica's population across to the Santa Susanas and the populations on the other side of the 101. And that project is well on its way. It's actually supposed to break ground the end of this year, early next year, to build a really large land, wildlife bridge structure. So that's going to be really fantastic to see that go up, because in California, we haven't done very much of that. It's actually been done quite a bit more in other Western states, and primarily for migrating herds of ungulates like elk and deer and pronghorn. But the other animals use them. So the bridges and big undercrossings can both function for many, many different species. Mountain lions aren't the only ones that are getting, genetically fragmented.
Do you have to train these animals to use these things? And if so, what does that look like? I mean, does a pronghorn go, oh, there's an overpass built specifically for me? Or do they just prod until they find, I don't know. How does it work? Sometimes typically there will be some accommodation to try to lure the animals maybe out onto a structure. There may be food out there intentionally put or something like that. But a lot of it, at least historically, they've found their way to them, somewhat naturally. They're combined with typically long fence, stretches of fencing, so that when animals approach a highway, they're naturally funneled, they kind of follow the fence trying to find a way through, and then here's this pathway. So some of them have been used surprisingly quickly. I think the literature suggests that it takes 2 or 3 years to establish a full level of use, for all the species that they anticipated would use it. But it doesn't take terribly long to at least get some using it.
I can imagine the overcrossings just being ideal. I've seen some of I've seen some of the other undercrossings and things, and I'm looking at some of these undercrossings going, if I was a lion and I could see out here, yes, it's a highway and I'm supposed to go there, and it doesn't look very good. So Pete, to answer your question, I think what happens is, the lions or the other animals, they walk up and they're like, freeway, a nice like vegetated pathway. It's they're not stupid. They're going to look at it and go, "That's great. I'm going that way."
Yeah, it's pretty essential though that they have good fencing, because there's always going to be some animals that are going to say, "Well, it's shorter to go across the highway, and I don't see any cars coming right now." But it's surprising sometimes with mountain lions, at least, and some other animals, how they will go. How they'll dare a freeway. It's sad, but it does happen, and it has happened, unfortunately, way too much in Southern California.
I have to say the fencing on the 241 toll road is fantastic. It is.
Yeah, it is.
It is amazing. I mean, for every single species that would cross that, the toll roads, it was amazing. And I think they've been successful. I think that from deer being on the the highway and mountain lions in particular, but I think those have declined since the fences have gone in.
Dramatically. That fencing, and that's a very we helped design or suggest the design of that fence, and it's one of the best ones probably in the country in terms. It was designed with a really key element being keeping mountain lions off that highway, because that was a big roadkill spot for mountain lions. And, it's 10 and 12 feet high. It's really tall, and it has barbed wire on the top, and it's dug into the ground. So it's really, it has cut roadkill in that fenced section by 98% or something like that. It's really, really now minimal. So it's been super successful. It was quite expensive though, and so there are other fencing projects that are less expensive that we hope are also just as successful in Orange County, and we've been doing some talking about the Ortega Highway, because it's got a roadkill hotspot along west of Casper's or east of Casper's, and then Caltrans is just completing fencing on I-15 to eliminate the roadkill down there and kind of funnel animals more, hopefully, to whatever structure is built or to the Temecula Creek Bridge.
Where does the funding come from fencing is expensive per, 100 feet of it. It's got to be $1 bajillion. And then who's buying it? Because like, if you work with Dave, there's 27 people you got to talk to all have a say. So
Winston knows what that's like.
That's what because the thing is the context of it's easy to say we're going to throw up a really high end fence, but when you go out to pay for it and have to go on to someone, it's not as easy as that.
Well, it's super expensive to build a bridge over a freeway for crossing. These are big dollar items. So that's a good question, Pete.
Well, the 101 bridge is a good example where they've pulled together funding from all kinds of different sources. The National Wildlife Federation had a big fundraising effort, and the Annenberg Foundation has pledged matching funds. Caltrans, the Wildlife Conservation Board, that you pretty much have to build it out of multiple areas, to do anything like that. The 241 toll road was the toll road agency itself paid for that. So our tolls, helped pay for that one. Caltrans is getting funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board to plan a new crossing on I-15. So it comes from a variety of sources. But yeah, they are really expensive, whether it's the fencing or the crossing structure.
Yeah, I just have one more question, and I'll let Dave do the last few minutes. But you studied big cats for a long time. What are some of the things you've discovered or learned about that just would blow us all away, that blew you away when you learned it? Because we look at them and we look at my little kitty in the backyard and we can see the parallels, but there's got to be, I don't study my cat. I just love it,
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. When we started out, we actually weren't even studying mountain lions in order to study mountain lions. We were studying bighorn sheep out in the Anza Borrego area. And we knew mountain lions were preying on the bighorns, and we wanted to find out just how big a problem they were. So we put collars on bighorns and collars on deer and collars on mountain lions, and we wanted to see, what's going on out here. And we found that surprisingly, it wasn't just this general thing that any mountain lion in the area would go after a bighorn. It turned out that there were specialists, and we have found that across other studies as well, that we have a specialist up in our Modoc County study, Northeast California, that specializes on wild horses. He hardly ever eats a deer. So it's just, there's variety out there among them. So that was a surprise. And the other big surprise was how high their mortality rates were. We thought the bighorns were in trouble, and it turned out that actually the mountain lions were at higher risk than the bighorns from a standpoint of population survival. And so that totally surprised us, and that led to a lot of this mountain lion focused, research. And then finally, probably the bigger surprise was just how fragmented the populations are, and how inbred, and how much these highways divide them. Because if you go down to I-15 and you look at it, there's habitat on both sides. It's like 300 feet of distance. There's some culverts there. There's a bridge. You'd think, well, they're mountain lions. They're big, they're fast, they're mobile. They should be able to figure this out. But surprisingly, they're more deterred by highways and the sound and the light and the people in the case of Temecula Creek Bridge than you would think. Plus, even if they get across the highway, they're at high risk of dying. And we're so dependent on these young males, because they're the only ones that are going to even give it a try. If you're a big male over here and you've got a happy little home territory, or you're a female with a home territory, why try to cross the highway? It's going to be these young males. And so we're totally dependent on them moving around the landscape, and they're at the highest risk of dying, from various reasons. So it kind of adds up to a lot of difficulty keeping these populations healthy.
Interesting. So, Winston, I want to ask you a question. Looking at the Santa Monica Mountains, they have done a fantastic job at like a public campaign in support of the lions. Mm-hmm. And it's, I believe it's being led by the National Park Service. But it's obviously getting supported by others. And how rare is that? That you get a lead agency that's willing to throw, because most public agencies are like, we don't want to talk about lions. Whenever people see a lion, they're afraid. They call us and complain that, whatever. So it's better not to talk about them. And in Santa Monica, they've taken the exact opposite approach of like, no, we're going to let you know who this lion is. We're going to let you know what their behaviors are. We're going to make you love this lion. And in exchange, that community seems to have rallied around these lions. Mm-hmm. And so when a lion gets into trouble, the community itself is like, oh no, don't shoot the lion. Yes, he ate your goat, but don't shoot him. Like how rare is that?
Well, I think it's pretty rare. I think you're right about that. In California, if you look at who's doing the research and who cares the most, it's universities, it's Cal Fish and Wildlife, but like you say, they are challenged by their multiple roles of trying to conserve the animal, but also protect the public and educate. And they've got lots of hats that they have to wear. In the Santa Monicas, it was that combination, National Park Service and the National Wildlife Federation, and I give a huge amount of credit to Beth Pratt, who's their California director, who has been tirelessly, promoting getting a new crossing there and getting the National Wildlife Federation on board. And they had that sort of key animal, P22, that they've been able to sort of take his images and take his sort of single uniqueness, because he's in Griffith Park. He's in a really small area, and he so embodies this isolation idea, and people can identify with this animal that's all alone in this area that's unusual, and he can't get back. Or if he does try to get back, he's at high risk. So, they've got that many. That those things have really been key. Tireless effort, because they've been at it for 20 plus years. Trying to do something, and so
they really should get a better name though than P22, like Sancho, Ricky, something like Dave said. You want to know, like, that's our cat, that's Ricky. I saw Ricky today.
But it's worked with P22, so
yeah, we can do better than P22.
Yeah.
I wish that there were more areas that were willing to do that. And there, there's been conversations and things, and there's a strong reluctance to go down that road, even using the success that Santa Monica has had as like, look, they've done it well. It's been successful. The community has responded, and it's just a shame to me that the other areas don't really follow suit on that and make that happen, because I think it goes a long way. So.
Yeah. Hey, one thing with the Santa Anas, if you think about it, it's a fragmented mountain range in terms of the management of it. In the Santa Monicas, it was all National Park Service. The Santa Anas, we have the Forest Service and you guys and various conservation organizations. We have the Marines down at Camp Pendleton.
Yep.
So there's, from a research standpoint, we've led the way, but from the standpoint of pushing for connectivity, the Nature Conservancy has been a big lead, down there in that I-15 area. But it does, there's not quite the same ability of one organization or two to be super, super focused, on it. So that's been a little bit of an issue there, but gradually I think that's changing. I think there's certainly general agreement we need to try to do something.
Yeah. And we've seen it in, like, unfortunately we lost one out in the Silverado area, a little while ago, a couple months ago, but I think even in that community, that's not the norm anymore. Like, I think that was the norm for a long time. It ate my goat. I shot it, and come pick it up. And now even out there, I think when that happens, that community actually kind of shuns those people for doing that, because they also understand that they're in trouble. They understand they live in this really unique community, and lions are part of it. And they accept that. But I think when someone shoots them, they get the wrath of the community out there as well.
What does a community do though? Like, we know we can make little islands for butterflies and grow milkweed and that kind of thing. You don't want to leave a goat tied up in your backyard, as like a gift, but how does someone, instead of pointing the finger at somebody else, how does someone take action with protecting wildlife? And if they're into mountain lions, they want to protect mountain lions. What do they do to create a positive return on their effort?
I think just being positive about helping to point out that even though any one owner of livestock might just be their odds of having a livestock animal killed is really, really low, just like an attack on a human. But cumulatively in the community, if there's just kind of a peer pressure to make sure that everybody's adequately protecting their livestock, that you can add to that. We do a lot of educational forums, for communities to try to promote that, and we try to train folks like the 4-H kids and the FFA kids so that they learn early on, how to do that. When it comes to the connectivity question, the biggest thing is political support when legislation comes up that can help help to fund things like crossings, and groups like the Mountain Lion Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, a number of other groups will put out information about, hey, call your legislator, about this particular bill, because ultimately, because of the cost of crossings, a lot of times that money has to come from bond issues or something that's really targeted for that kind of thing. And there are both bond issue funds and legislative efforts right now, to improve the amount of money that can be put into connectivity.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on. This was awesome. And I know Dave and I are going to want to have you come on again and talk more about cats, because there's about 100 questions that I know I didn't get to. But Dave, anything in closing?
I want to ask one real quick question of how concerned are you with what's going on with wildfires right now in the entire state, and how that's going to affect the lion populations?
Well, big fires certainly affect multiple mountain lion territories, and we found that they can have just an entire territory wiped out, which means they have to move next door and challenge another lion. It certainly has negative effects. A lot depends on the matrix of fire, and we're actually doing a statewide analysis of that exact question right now, and give a lot of credit to people at Fish and Wildlife and the other researchers in the state, because we all collectively have done a lot of joint analyses, because it's just impossible for any one group to gather enough data to answer some of these questions. So we have there's a postdoc that's right now doing a big analysis of all these different fire regimes and how it affected the mountain lions. So I can probably tell you more about that next year.
Future.
All right, perfect.
Winston, I want to personally thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate that you did that with us, and I also want to thank you for all the work that you've been doing throughout your career. It's tremendous. It's super important.
Thanks, and I super appreciate all the landowners and managers' cooperation, because that's been essential for us getting onto the landscape to do the work.
Nice,
excellent.
Yeah, thanks for everything, Winston. If no one else tells you, Dave and I for sure appreciate you. Everybody go out there and protect your kitty. All right, hang on. I'm going to roll this thing. Stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you